on our program, we're going to delve into just what does 4R stewardship mean. And Jeremy Boychyn is going to help us with that. Now, Jeremy grew up on a family farm in Ontario. He attended the University of Guelph, getting his Bachelor of Science in Horticultural Science and also a Master's in Plant Physiology. Now, his master's work looked at some of the developmental and physiological effects of drought and low fertility on North American native perennial plants. Sounds like he was destined to come to southern Alberta right from the start. He began his career as an agronomist in Ontario, but in 2015 he did indeed go west, where he worked as an agronomist and technical specialist in various regions, really getting to know our province. And Jeremy is now serving as the Agronomy Research Extension Specialist with the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. And that's where he's able to connect valued research findings right to Alberta's wheat and barley growers. A lot of research happens, but getting it to the growers and helping them is a great part of the job. Jeremy loves being the Commission's boots on the ground, driving research and innovation right to the farm gate, and we look forward to hearing from him. Jeremy?
That's quite the intro. Thank you. Before I start, my wife talks about it all the time when she was a child, and they rarely got to go out for dinner. And she says, in her words, because she was Dutch, and that wasn't very often that happened. And I feel like because we haven't been able to get together recently, I feel like this is my going out for dinner now. You do all these webinars and everything's online, so it's very nice to be here in front of all of you and be able to talk about something like 4-H or 4R. I got 4-H on the mind now. So I'll be talking about 4R nutrient stewardship. This topic has been coming up more and more recently, and I think there's a couple of reasons why this is happening. One, the price of fertilizer is obviously through the roof, and people are asking, how do I make more of the fertilizer that I'm using and I'm paying for? How do I make it go longer and produce more? And the second is there's been some policy discussions around reduced emissions of fertilizer and what that means. And I think between those two things, there's a lot of rumblings around, how am I using fertilizer? What does it mean to reduce emissions? So I kind of want to revitalize and kind of have that conversation of 4R again. And I'll show you why I'm up here talking about this again. But before I get too far, I just want to thank all the researchers that do this work. I am an extension person. I do not do the research. It is the researchers that provide this information so I can stand up here and tell a story and hopefully provide some information so you guys can either go home and work with producers to implement some of these management practices or take it and implement it on your own farm. So a few of the names that I pulled research from. So when we talk about 4-H, the first thing I want to do is kind of talk about efficiency. And we can look at efficiency in a variety of different ways on farm. We're looking at output divided by input. So how much work am I putting in and what am I getting out of that? And what is that efficiency ratio? And we're always looking to get more out of putting either less or the same amount in. So the target is to be more efficient with what we're putting in. And again, we can look at this as land use efficiency. And this can be done in a variety of ways when we're looking at land use efficiency. What genetics am I using? How am I managing the soil? How am I utilizing irrigation? So it can encompass a variety of different things for that output. And then water use efficiency, again, how am I utilizing irrigation? Am I using crops that are more water use efficient, like winter or fall seeded cereals, which take better advantage of spring moisture? So there's a variety of different ways we can look at this. Fuel use efficiency, labor use efficiency. There's something known as total factor productivity, which encompasses everything on the farm, how much you're putting in, and then how much you're getting out. But I want to talk today about nutrient use efficiency. How much am I getting out for each nutrient I'm putting in? So fertilizer use efficiency, how am I making the most out of what I'm spending money on? And I think a wonderful way that we can look at that question is through 4R. 4R has been around for a while. It's not new. You're saying, Jeremy, I've heard of this before, but we're going to go through it. And again, I'm going to show you why I think it's important. 4R is essentially broken down into 4 segments: right place, right time, right source, and right rate. And all of these are looked at in a question of how am I becoming the most efficient I can be with the fertilizer that I'm using, both economically and environmentally. So when I first started building this, I thought, oh, most people have heard about 4R, right? Like, who implements 4R? Is anyone actually registered 4R on their farm? We got one keener over here like that. So Fertilizer Canada did a survey last year, canola growers, and asked the question of how familiar they are with 4R. And I was shocked to see that in 2020, 42.4% of producers are lower than somewhat familiar, which I was a little bit surprised with. I think I was surprised because a lot of producers that I talk to implement some of these practices already, so I thought the familiarity was out there. So my goal today is to maybe take those in this room and maybe increase the familiarity with 4R and what that means. And I'm going to delve into a couple of maybe questions around economics and efficiency of fertilizer use, because there's some recommendations out there that's, we look at it as it's going to be environmentally beneficial, but the economics of it are still up for debate and a little bit of a challenge. So I'll use the example of source here. So when we look at 4R, again, it's broken into 4 different groups, but what they've done is they've actually broken it down into 3 different levels: basic, intermediate, and advanced. And the more advanced you go, the more technology or the more tactics you're using to be more efficient. That's the theory. But the one thing we want to think about when we're looking at 4R is they've developed this, and this is developed for across Canada, and it's also implemented in the US. So we need to think about these recommendations and these practices a little bit malleable based on the growing season that you have, what you're working with in terms of environmental conditions, the crops you have, and the equipment that you have. So not everyone can fall nice and neatly into each category. So when we look at source, this is kind of the first basic way we want to look at how am I utilizing nitrogen efficiently. And I'm going to focus mostly on nitrogen. There is the phosphorus aspect of this, but we'll focus on nitrogen in this. So at the basic level, we're looking at using ammonium-based sources in the fall. We don't want to be using nitrate-based sources in the fall because when we do, there's a higher risk of loss between when we do that application and when the plant is, or the crop is going to end up using that nitrogen source. So pretty basic level of let's use products that are at least risk of loss during that time between application and use. And in the spring, really on that basic level, using any form of nitrogen, we're in closer proximity of when the crop is going to utilize that nitrogen source. Intermediate, we're increasing to enhanced efficiency of fertilizers when there is an idea of risk. And when we say risk, volatilization, denitrification, these are processes that happen naturally under certain environmental conditions. So denitrification when there's excess moisture, volatilization when we're warm and windy, and that nitrogen source is sitting on the surface. And before we go too far there, is everyone familiar with enhanced efficiency fertilizers? I'm going to give a bit of a definition so when we move forward we have a pretty strong understanding. So really we're looking at either a physical or chemical barrier to that nitrogen being lost to the environment. So with something like ESN, there's a physical barrier to stop that nitrogen from going into the environment. We also have nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, which are those natural processes that happen in the soil that stop the nitrogen source from turning into something that is easily lost to the environment through volatilization or leaching. So these can come in a variety of different forms, and a variety of different companies provide them, but I won't go into detail about that. I'll leave that up for you guys to research. So why are enhanced efficiency fertilizers being talked about with 4R with 4R. And this slide right here kind of paints a picture of why it's becoming more and more part of the conversation. So this is a chart that demonstrates the amount of nitrous oxide released from different forms of nitrogen when banded with spring wheat. So we have a control here, which is no nitrogen applied. We have urea on the far right, and then we have the different forms of nitrogen. And you can see compared to urea, every other nitrogen source, with the exception of ESN, unsure why ESN sits so high, actually reduces the amount of nitrous oxide. And the reason this is important is because nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that's actually 300 times stronger than CO2. So this is a very important focus for policymakers, so it's part of their concern and consideration. So when we look at enhanced efficiency fertilizers, this is why that is such a focus. But what does that actually mean for farm economics? Why is that important to you? And what does it mean on farm? So this is research that is still ongoing right now. There's still 3 years worth of research to go on this, so 15 site years, so it's still being collected, so this is preliminary data. But looking at 5 different enhanced efficiency fertilizers, banded with urea at the time of seeding, 8 of the 11 site years showed no significant difference in yield using these different nitrogen sources. So a little bit more of a premium to use these products, decreasing the amount of greenhouse gases being released. However, we're not seeing a huge yield benefit out of these, which then becomes a challenge. Gonna skip right through all those. So let's jump on to rate. When we talk about rate, we're talking about making sure that we're putting the appropriate amount of nitrogen on, so we're not putting in excess that can be lost to the environment, but we're also not shorting ourselves the opportunity to produce a good yield, a good crop, and take most advantage of the nitrogen that we're putting down. So again, the 3 basic levels there. Doing soil tests and looking at your nitrogen balance, what's in there, and then looking at yield potential based on yield curves that have been produced through research. So that soil test is fundamental to get an idea of how much nitrogen you're working with. I mean, we look at a year like this past year where there wasn't a lot of crop to be had because of drought. So how much of that nitrate or nitrogen is still sitting in the soil for use this coming year? And if we don't take those soil tests and assess how much is there, how do we know how much we need to apply? And if we apply the same amount we did last year, potential for overage, potential for loss, it's not as efficient on your dollar. You can jump into the intermediate where we start applying based on variability, and you can do that with your monitor now, changing as you're driving through the field. And then with the advanced, we're stepping up to variable rate nitrogen, doing prescriptions that way, and in some situations, post-harvest and assessment. So doing samples right after harvest, how much nitrates are there, how much didn't I use based on my yield and based on what I applied and the rainfall. So a little bit more intricate, but gives you a stronger idea of what your crop actually used based on those environmental conditions. And this is what I'm looking at in terms of nitrogen response curves. So this was developed by Ross McKenzie and Dune Poly. This was 2019. So these are the response curves for CWRS, CPS, Durham, and what else is on there? Soft wheat, based on 30 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. So looking at this chart, you do your soil test, you figure out how much is there, what your yield potential is based on your region, and then make an assessment of how much nitrogen you should be putting down. And they also develop these nice charts to kind of break down based on soil zone and how much nitrogen you have available. So using this, you can be more efficient with the nitrogen that you have. Into timing. So timing is an interesting one, and I think there's been a lot of questions about, can I be doing nitrogen applications in crop? Is this going to make a difference? Am I going to be more efficient? I don't want to put all of my nitrogen up front. The cost is huge right now. Can I split it based on how much rainfall is coming down? And I think these are important questions, right? It's a lot of risk to be throwing all of that out right at the beginning of the season when we have very little rainfall from last year, subsoil moisture is low, and who knows how much rain is going to come this year. So it's an important question. But there's also the question of fall versus spring. So on the basic level, we're looking at late fall application. And you may be asking me, what does late fall mean? Does anyone want to give an answer on what I mean by late fall? Application of nitrogen? When is late fall? October? What? When the soil cools off. Compared to what? I like that answer. So I asked Don Flayton that question. I said, what does it mean? When is the appropriate timing? And he said, soil temperature actually hasn't been the best indicator of when we should be applying fall nitrogen. And keep in mind, he's in Manitoba, a lot more moisture, a lot more organic matter, so that we need to keep that in mind. But he's indicated that actually time of year might be a better indicator. If we're looking at October and after as late fall, we can rely on the temperature not actually fluctuating above where we want it to be, because when it starts fluctuating, then we get those releases and we get those losses. Where if we wait till after October 15th, typically, if the temperature has dropped, and sometimes I hear 10 degrees, sometimes I hear 5 degrees, we don't want the soil to be frozen, but we want it to be cool. I would say below, let's say 7 or 8, late October, you're getting less loss in those situations. You're also looking at spring before at seeding, falling in that basic category, and not applying on frozen soil or snow. Obviously, huge potential for loss over the soil. So we don't want to be doing that as well. So this is, can you guys see that okay? So this was research out of Manitoba, again, coming from Don Flayton. And what they did was they applied nitrogen at different times in the fall on different areas of the field. And they essentially have a high slope and a low slope. So one where there's greater potential for excess moisture and one where there's less potential for excess moisture. What they found, and I don't think I can do this with a pointer. I can't see it from there. So what they found, if you look at that first, what's happening here? Ooh. I'm not even in control of that. So if you look at that first column there, so underneath grain yield increase, kilograms per hectare. So if you go down to late fall on the low treatment or on the low soil slope area, you can see that that is where we're providing that higher yield potential to a later application of nitrogen. On the higher soil zones, on the higher slopes, didn't really seem to have as much of an effect. On the lower slopes, it had more of an effect. So something to consider that when we start applying too early, there's a higher potential for loss, especially in those higher moisture conditions. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? So this is something to keep in mind when you're timing application. Taking soil temperature and looking at the time of the year is going to be important. If you only look at soil temperature, you're still putting yourself at risk of loss. And that's what I wanted to drive home with this is time of year, but also soil temperature. And then we move up to the intermediate level, so in-season applications. And I love Zoidberg, so I'm going to throw him up here. When we look at the slope of nutrient uptake of wheat, we can see that first thing in the season is certainly not the most aggressive uptake of nitrogen by that crop. It progresses as we go through the season, it starts taking up more. So can we better align maybe a nitrate-sourced nitrogen in season and get a increased yield potential or save some losses? Can we be better timed with our nitrogen through the season? So this is research out of Manitoba, and I'm sorry I keep pulling Manitoba in this. They seem to be the most focused on some of this, but I'm trying to tie it back to Alberta. So this was research on emissions in grain corn, 2018, 19, and 20. You can see with the urea incorporated pre-plant In 2018, you can see there's a very high level of nitrate emissions, right? We're seeing a lot of emissions coming from that urea application. And as we go into in-season applications, surface dribble, deep injection of UAN, we on average see a decrease in the amount of nitrates or nitrous oxide released through those application methods. So again, this is becoming a focus on how do we decrease greenhouse gas emissions. But the real question is, what does that actually mean for economics of the farm? It's great, we can decrease emissions, we can feel like we're being more efficient with the nitrogen that we're using. But when we look at, so this is a research study that was done in Alberta and a bit of Saskatchewan. Again, this is preliminary research as well. There's still 15 more site years to come in over the next few years. But this is comparing all nitrogen deep banded at seeding compared to a dual application. And that dual application is using Super U at seeding and then at boot, and then a triple application seeding, tillering, and boot. And what they found was really we're seeing variable response in terms of yield. So you can see in Lethbridge in 2019, we actually had much better yield when all the urea was applied right at seeding. In Barhead and YEG, you can see, again, a little bit of an increase coming from that split, but then when we get to Scott, really no difference in that application, different timings, and then in Indian Head, it's better at deep banded or just the double split. And then in 2020, we see kind of similar trends of not being able to see consistent trends, essentially. So no difference in Lethbridge. It looked like earlier of just deep banding at seeding was the better result in terms of yield. At Lethbridge, YEG, Vermilion, and Scott, and then in Indian Head, no difference. So this is the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but where do the economics of it land? And we're certainly in a situation where more research needs to be done, because I really think there's a G by E by M factor that's going on here of, do the genetics play a role? Does the environment play a role, which we know it does? And then what managements are already in place that may impact what those numbers look like? And then we get into the last one, which is place. So this is how close are we getting that nutrient to where it's being used? The further it is, the increased potential loss. The closer it is, the more chance that that crop is going to take it up. So on the basic level, we're looking at in-soil banded, so that's banded right with the crop, and then spring broadcast and incorporated, and then fall, and I've added later broadcast with an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, and take the enhanced efficiency fertilizer as you will based on the information you've seen at this point. And then when we go above that, using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer to avoid volatilization if we're doing a surface application in crop or at the beginning before seeding. And then if we take it to the advanced level, no fall broadcast of nitrogen whatsoever. And that is just that spatial difference between when you're applying and when it's being used. There's that increased risk there. Remember when I said that environmental conditions play a role in this, and this is based off of recommendations for Canada-wide. This is where that moisture aspect plays a role, because that longer timing plus add moisture, we have an increased risk of loss. And if you actually look at some of the nitrogen recommendations that came from research from Ross McKenzie, you can see that fall banded application is actually very efficient in dry conditions. When we look at non-dry conditions, that's when we start to have that loss potential and that efficiency loss potential of banding in the fall. And then I wanted to demonstrate this as well to kind of tie in that placement plus enhanced efficiency fertilizer conversation. So again, this is out of Manitoba, but what they did was look at control, and then this is urea broadcast incorporated, urea side banded, and then urea deep banded. And you can see based on where it's placed, there's an increased potential of, and this is emissions rating based on fertilizer use. So shallow banded, obviously creating more loss, being less efficient based on the amount of emissions. And then deep banding, a lower risk of loss. But when we apply super U, so protecting that loss, the emissions reduce significantly. So you can see with enhanced efficiency fertilizers that we decrease the environmental factor, but the economics become a challenge. So in summary, these are the take-home messages. If you're not familiar with 4R nutrient stewardship, it's something to become familiar with and look at that lens on your farm. Most farms are probably already enacting a lot of these, but if you're not, take a look at what you aren't and ask the question of where the economics lay with this. Keep good fertilizer management records. And for those things that you're not familiar with, again, ask the question, what might this look like on my farm? How can I do trials to assess the potential value? And then just kind of a thought, policy changes may come from an emissions standpoint and not always an economic standpoint. And the example that John Hurd kind of showed me was leaded versus unleaded fuel. There was a point where you had a choice, and then that choice was taken away because of the environmental factor that's there. So understanding the tool, understanding how it may impact your farm based on the management you have, will better prepare you if that time does come. That's it.
Before you dash away, let's find out if there's any questions for you, Jeremy, on 4R stewardship or some of the findings that you shared with us. Hello, anybody? Yep, okay.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Boss is
Boss is talking, yeah.
You're the guy that threw something at me last time, right?
Actually, I wanted to switch gears just a little bit from the body of your presentation. The elephant in the room, if you will, is the 30% potential mandate of emission reductions or fertilizer reductions. We're not even sure what the definition of that is. But maybe just if you could inform the group on some of the work we're doing with Fertilizer Canada to collect data on fertilizer use and for our...
The real facts.
Yeah, so we are working with Fertilizer Canada right now to do a fertilizer use survey with wheat to get a better understanding how fertilizer is being used in Alberta and actually all of Western Canada. So we can take that information back and have those discussions with policymakers because like I said, and like you're kind of looking at me saying, we're implementing a lot of these practices already. They're not always aware of that. So gaining that knowledge and gaining that data on how fertilizer is being used currently, that in general, producers in Western Canada are being as efficient as they can with the fertilizer that they're implementing, is going to allow us to have those conversations with policymakers and demonstrate that we're already working towards these goals because reduced emissions typically means more efficiency of your nutrient use, which typically means better economics. So strengthening the conversation, and obviously we're keeping a close eye on what those policy makers are saying. But again, as Tom kind of pointed out, is they really haven't provided any kind of direction on what that's going to look like yet. So getting our ducks in a row and making sure we have a good understanding of how fertilizer is being used right now will help us have that conversation as it continues on.
Establishing that baseline even to begin with. Yeah.
Absolutely, yep.
We got a question at the back. Oh, and I'll come back over here, Laverne. Go ahead.
I've seen work or I've seen stuff where they say that we're only getting 50% of our nitrogen into the plants.
Mm-hmm.
So with those studies where you have like the staged, like up to 3 different applications, if you just reduce the rate by 30%, you think we would see differences in the data then? So say if on studies where you had the 100% all up front and then the dual and then the triple,
Are you saying that with the split application, we may not require as much nitrogen application?
Maybe because we're putting enough on or too much on at the current rates, we're not seeing the yield separation.
I think that's an excellent question. And as you can see, I mean, we're kind of digging into this understanding right now of, okay, well, we saw differences between a urease inhibitor and ESN. So what does that mean? And does that process work for ESN or only UAN with agrotane? And in what environmental condition might that be more conducive? So these are questions that are important that I think, as we start to ask these questions and integrate that G by E by M factor, where all of these things play a role, we may be able to better answer that question. But from my understanding, I don't think we have the answer to that right now. And that is a big proponent of the conversation. And you hear, how do I say this? The thought is that enhanced efficiency fertilizers should bring about a reduction in the requirement of nitrogen applied. But as you can see, we're not seeing that, or we're not doing it in a way where that is conducive.
So finding out more about whether it's timing or rates, yeah.
As a person in research, I mean, I'm always going to point to more research.
Yeah. That's why we have Farming Smarter, right. Okay, I'll get to you, John. I think Laverne had one there. Go ahead.
Yeah, it might be off topic a little bit here, but can you shed any light on the digital production of fertilizer? There's talk about that now versus cracking gas or natural gas and using it that way.
Yes, I'm certainly not in that side of the industry, so I won't be able to provide a lot of light. I get the impression that fertilizer companies are looking to find that market space of being a more efficient fertilizer because, I don't know if I want to go down that road. I don't have a good answer for you, but I think they are looking into it, but what that means for us yet, I think there's just too much gray area to get an understanding. There's so much policy involved, it's hard to say.
Okay, well, some questions, have more questions.
Oh, didn't mention leaf testing in the growing season.
Okay, leach testing in the growing season.
Leaf testing in the growing season? Yeah, so I haven't seen a lot of research looking at leaf testing and then making a fertilizer application based on that. And I think it becomes a challenge because you're not just looking at how much nitrogen is in the leaf isn't always just an indicator of how much nitrogen there is in the soil, because that soil may be tied up in different ways. There may be an excess amount of moisture. So applying more nitrogen because the leaf shows that there's not enough nitrogen isn't always an efficient way of using nitrogen. So I think we can't just look at leaf testing as the indicator. I think it needs to be combined with how much nitrates are in the soil at that time, what's the soil moisture looking like, what's actually available to the plant. So I think why that hasn't taken off is because the complexity is more than what meets the eye, if that's a reasonable answer.
Oh, we're flooded with questions. Okay, I'm going to go John, and then I'll come over here. Go ahead, John.
Short question, in terms of nitrogen recovery, when you look at yield solely in the nitrogen oxide, are there any considerations with protein?
Yeah, so that, I didn't put that information in there because I already was kind of crammed for time. Essentially, it's the same result, it's variable. There wasn't really any kind of clear indication of enhanced efficiency fertilizers or split nitrogen providing a protein or quality benefit. And again, I think it's that environmental factor and management already in place factor that may be playing a role that makes it more complex than just adding more nitrogen late in the season. You know, if you look at the yield and then protein curve, we only really get that yield boost or the protein boost when we've already reached maximum yield potential. And then we have supplemental nitrogen in there. So with these planned trials, if we are putting this much nitrogen down, if that amount of nitrogen, even if it's distributed along, isn't helping that crop meet the maximum yield potential, it's not going into protein after, right? And I think there's a lot of environmental factors that'll go into what's your nitrogen source, what's the soil type like at that point, how much moisture is in that soil, how is it breaking down, how quickly is it breaking down, is it timed appropriately for it to be taken up and go into that grain for protein. So there's a lot of compounding factors that make it, again, more complex than just applying nitrogen at flag leaf or at anthesis to get a yield boost. And I think that because we have such variable environmental conditions, and I worked in Ontario, and they're like, we know if we apply 20 pounds of UAN at this timing, we're going to get a 1% yield bump every year, assuming we get the 9 out of 10 years that we get every year, right? But we don't have those conditions. So this becomes a decision of economics versus risk.
Okay, I'll just take one last question, and then we better move on. Go ahead, yeah.
Comments more than questions. Sorry. The 50% nitrogen use efficiency is unrealistic for Western Canada. We're running more like 80 to 90% in a lot of cases. There's times when it's different, but we're much better than 50. You were in our rainfall area and 50 inches of rain, we're 50%. So that's one thing I think that really needs to be understood. Soils make a huge difference. Environmental conditions make a huge difference. The reason you can't find any data in Alberta is because you're buying it. There has been some testing done. It's been written up a little bit with some private testing. There's a gentleman in the Freedom area that's tried for years and years to put applications of fertilizer. And generally speaking, you can apply it, but you don't get a rain in the pool in the ground, and you don't get it. So don't worry about it.
What's your name? Rusty. Okay. I'll come bug you later. I'm curious
you
of
can
those
connect
thoughts.
with him. Okay. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you, Jeremy Boychyn. Obviously, generated lots of thought and question. Whoa! You got it. We have for you. Yeah. I'm not going to hit you.
What do you want me to do with that thing?
This is a shoehorn, a Farming Smarter shoehorn.
Ooh.
So you don't even have to bend down.
So my back is
exactly.
behind me.
So thank you very
so much.
Send the card there.
Oh, thank you.
Let's thank Jeremy for his presentation.